Natural Herb Keeper. We're pretty excited today to bring you our first ever YouTube video for the Natural Herb Keeper, and to kick things off I thought I would jump in and run you guys through how I built the naturalistic background in the enclosure here behind me. Now this enclosure houses my Nullarbor Bearded Dragon, that's this little dude here, and I'm going to run you through step by step how that was created, maybe give you some tips and hints along the way so that you can do something similar yourself. So I'm going to pop this little guy away and we're going to jump in and have a look. Alright, so to jump right in guys, obviously to start any enclosure build you need an enclosure. So this one here is a custom build that I put together. Measures 1.4 meters long by 70 centimeters tall and 60 centimeters wide. You'll also see I've got a few bits and pieces there to start the build. My hot wire cutter, can't get away without one of these. And then you just want to start cutting and shaping your foam. Okay, now this bit does get messy. Cutting any polystyrene without the hot foam cutter, you're going to end up with a bit of a mess, exactly like we're looking at here at the moment. Okay, so it is important to get some of your shape in while you're putting your polystyrene together, but you don't need to put all of it in. Okay, so as you can see, there's some shape. We've got a little bit of contours where I'm going to have some of the cracks later on, but it doesn't have to be all of it. Alright, we're going to put a lot more of that detail in once we get to the final concrete and grout layers at the end. So I usually hold all of these together with some timber toothpicks or bamboo toothpicks until I get the shape that I'm looking for, and then silicone it all together. Now once it's all siliconed and expander foamed, we're going to get on to grouting. Now you can see I've made a couple of extra rocks there. We'll put those together towards the end as well. And this is basically what we're looking at once all the foam is in place. We've expander foamed any gaps, carve that back so the grout will stick to it. Got all our tools ready, everything's in place, and it's time to start grouting. Now normally I'd do a light color grout as your first layer, and then we're going to jump over to the dark color, which is what we're looking at now. Okay, so that's the second coat on. Now for making the grout mixture, it is simply grout, water, and then adding your oxides to get your color. In this mix I'm actually trying something a little bit different here, and I'm adding some sand to the final layer of grout. So I was going for a bit of a different texture in this, hoping to get a bit more of that sandstony, limestoney sort of look. So I've added that sand into that mixture to sort of roughen it up a little bit. Other builds where I want it to be a lot smoother, obviously you wouldn't be putting that sand in. So as you can see, it's just straight oxide for colors, bit of fine play sand there, and just a standard off the shelf grout. Okay, nothing too extravagant. So when it comes to putting the grout on, often the first layer I'll pop on with a paintbrush. It allows you to get into all those little nooks and crannies a lot better. The first layer would obviously usually go on quite a bit runnier as well. Once we get to this layer, which is our third layer and our final layer for this build, we're going to be putting it on fairly thick. So I use my hands for this. It's much easier. I find I get a better result, and I can get into all those little gaps a lot better as well. I can also pack it on a lot thicker if I want to sculpt different areas. Now I'm using gloves in this. It is handy to find yourself a good pair of gardening gloves that have a bit of grip to them. If not, you will lose countless layers of skin off your fingers and hand, and that's not particularly fun. So whack the gloves on does make it a lot easier. You'll also notice while I'm doing this that I'm using a bamboo skewer again, and I use these just to help carve in little detail. So I'm basically scraping out any extra grout that might be getting into you know, the cracks or the places where I don't want it, and also helping to push it in right to the back so there's no exposed foam or expander foam in any of those areas as well. Now putting the final coat on again, this is sort of the time where you can be adding extra bits of grout so you can make this layer quite dry or firm, so that you can actually build out from areas, adding extra depth to the enclosure. So you don't want to have things just fairly flat. You want to try and get as much detail and different layers and depth into that as possible. Okay, that's where it's really going to make the whole thing come together and not just look like a flat back wall with you know, a bit of carving on it. So add that to this final layer here. So take your time with this one. Make sure that as you're working through it, you're finding all that little detail. I usually have quite a lot of reference material around me at this point, so photos of the area that I'm looking at, and that's what I work from. So I'm continuously looking at those photos and going from there. So now, again, slightly different for this final coat to what I've done before. As the grout was wet, as I'd put it on, I actually used that fine sand that we saw before and compacted that on. So I pushed that into the grout, just using handfuls of it at the time, pushed it in as much as I possibly could while it was drying, and we'll waiting to see what sort of texture that would bring out. So again, it's all about trying new things. If you don't like it, it's as simple as getting another layer of grout and just redoing what you don't like. Okay, so it is all experimentation and just giving it a shot. Again, this is a bit of experimentation. I haven't done this before using that sand. I did just lightly spray it, and then as it's mainly dried, okay, by this point, go back, brush off the extra sand, and then I really start carving the detail into the rocks. So again, I've got my timber or bamboo skewer. By this point, your grout should ideally be almost dry, but not completely. So if it's completely dry, you're not going to be able to carve it out very easily. If you get it just before that point that it's really dry, usually for this one I waited about an hour before I went back and started carving, and it was dry to the touch, still cool, so you can still feel it's a little bit damp in there, and as you can see, I can carve it out fairly easily. So at this point, I'm going through and adding all sorts of detail, following what's already there in terms of the rock, the line work, what I think will look more natural, and even just chipping away whole chunks. Okay, so the idea of having a dark layered grout as your second layer, and then your third layer is that light color on top. As you'll see in these little bits, as I'm chipping it away, as I'm carving that out, bits of that black second coat will come through. Now that's great, that's what we're after. It's going to help giving us that aged texture once we get to the end of the whole project. Okay, now I know it kind of looks tedious putting all this little details in, but this again, once we start painting it at the end, once we start aging it, this is where all the detail is going to come into it. Okay, this is what's going to actually make this stand out as a real rock and not just a flat piece of concrete. So it's personal opinion, and personal preference, what you like to do, but for me, I like to take the extra time and effort in this stage and really carve through as much detail, even just scraping off little bits, so it's just not a flat, even surface. Okay. So standard tools of the trade, paintbrushes. These are invaluable. Doesn't have to be anything expensive. These are just the cheapest ones I can buy. I go through them fairly quickly, and it's just constantly pushing that stuff that you've scraped off or you've carved off, getting that out of the way, making sure your cracks and crevices are neat, that you can see into them, and just having a look at exactly what's happening, how the carving's going, where the lines are forming. Again, I have huge amounts of reference material all around me at this stage. I'm constantly going back to those, having a look, seeing what the rocks that I'm trying to replicate look like, and just attempting to add that in. doesn't all have to be straight lines. You can have curves in there, you can chip bits off, you can have all bits and pieces, whatever suits your taste, and depends obviously on the type of rocks that you're creating as well. So this does take a fair amount of time, okay? So it's not a quick process by any means. This will, for an average size enclosure like this, the actual carving probably took me a good 2 to 3 hours to get this all done. But as you can see, you can really start to carve out chunks and really turn it into something pretty spectacular. So it won't look like a lot again. As you're carving it in, you might think it doesn't look natural, definitely, but again, once we start aging it, once we get that paint on, the black in there, this is really going to make it stand out. Once you've finished carving everything, basically final cleanup. So go through, brush it all down. I try and get out as much of the debris as I can with the dustpan and brush first, and then get back in there with the vacuum cleaner and clean out all those little bits. Now, if you've carved it a little bit too deep, you've gone back to foam in a couple of spots, that's not a problem. Okay, don't stress about that. Once we get to the end like this, all we're going to do is make a little bit more of our grout mixture, and you can see here it's quite thick this time. Okay, we're fairly dry, thick and firm, and we're just going to go and patch up any of those little holes. So again, using my trusty little timber skewer to get into those spots, and just covering those up as much as possible. Okay, that'll just prevent any insects or bugs from getting in there and chewing your foam. So that's something that you definitely don't want to happen. So it is important to make sure that all of your foam is covered in a good layer. That'll prevent any of your either feeder insects that might get away, or indeed your cleanup crew from chewing holes in your background. So just make sure once you get to this point that you go back and just double check all those little cracks and crevices as well that you've created, and make sure that everywhere is covered, and fill up any little gaps that you might find along the way. So once you've completed all of that, the next stage we're going to get on to is aging. So you've probably heard me talk about this a little bit before. By aging, I mean we need to make these rocks look like they're old. So the easiest way I've found to do this is give the entire enclosure a light spray down with water to start with. You don't want this soaking wet, but you just want the whole thing lightly covered, okay? This is going to help the water spread so that we don't end up with actual droplets of colour on the wall, okay? It's going to spread through it and just make it look like it's in the rock work itself. So to make the spray, it's simply acrylic black paint, a small amount of that in a spray bottle, filled up with water. Shake it well until it's all mixed and dissolved, and then spray it on. Now you'll see in little bits like this, I'm going to go back and actually add extra water and extra black. So I'm going to put the black in the crevices, I'm going to concentrate it in a few areas, come back with my spray bottle of water, give it a light spray on the open surfaces, so that way I'm going to get a much darker look in the crevices than what's on the outside of the rock. So again, we were trying to make those crevices nice and dark, nice and black. That's going to give the illusion that it's a deep crevice going well back into the rock face, and lightening the outside of the rocks a little bit. Now if you put your black paint on and you get a great big splodge of it somewhere, or you get actual droplets that you don't want, just get back in there with your freshwater spray bottle, spray some on. That should usually clear it up pretty quickly. If it doesn't, you can of course just rub it off as well at that point when it's quite wet. Now for this one, I actually let the water and the black paint pool in that top basking rock there, okay? So the idea for that is it would be where water would naturally pool out in the wild, and once it dries, we're going to get a really nice grey wash in that area, looking like it's somewhere where water would have sat and then dried off over time. Now this does make a mess, okay? I'm not going to lie, you get black everywhere, I usually just grab an old towel and mop up the bottom of the enclosure. It doesn't have to be bone dry, but obviously you don't want water sitting in the bottom there, so we just mop that up. But it is going to make a mess, okay? Probably should have worn gloves at this stage because it did end up everywhere. You'd think I would know by now, but alas, I haven't, and I still end up with hands covered in black paint for days. So learn from my mistake and put your gloves on. Now, we did the same technique on these sort of individual rocks as we did on the main wall. So as the concrete or the grout on here was put on quite wet and quite thick, I pushed on as much sand as I could as well, left them to dry, and now what I'm doing is just brushing that sand off. Okay, so simply again, paintbrush, going around, giving it a good scrub, seeing what it comes off and what doesn't come off. And I was pretty impressed with this technique. It actually gave a really nice sandstone or limestoney effect, and it looks a lot different to most of the other builds that I've done, which is pretty cool. So again, it is all about trial and error. You just have to get out there and give these guys a shot and see what you come up with. And if you don't like it, you simply go back, fix it and do it again. So you'll see I've made quite a few rocks here. I do think it is really important to have a lot of extra small rocks that you can put into your enclosure at the end. I think this is one part that really makes it. It's not something I've always done, it's something I've only started doing recently, and I really think this helps to bring the entire enclosure together. If you can have these extra rocks that blend in exactly to your background, they look like part of the enclosure. It just brings the entire thing together, and you can see the detail in these rocks here. So the next thing we're going to get stuck into once everything is dry, I usually leave it about 24 hours after doing the black aging coat before I start this next section. And this is just really getting that depth into all your cracks and crevices. So again, I've just got straight black acrylic paint. I've got a little container of water there. I use quite a fine paintbrush for this, and I'm usually watering it down. Not as much as we did in that black aging spray, so it's not as watered down as that, but a little bit will just help it spread into the grout without looking like you're painting a solid line. Now, these areas are going to look a lot darker, they will stand out, but don't worry, we will blend all of that in once we start getting our other colors. So for the rest of the paint, what I like to do is a dry brush method. I'm pretty basic. I start with a few fairly basic colors, usually red, yellow, sometimes I'll have a brown in there, black and white. Okay, nothing too spectacular or complicated. And I have a fairly stiff bristled brush for this. Again, only fine, it's a small enclosure, so I'm only using fine brushes. And what you want to do is get a little bit of paint on your brush. I usually just mix together the colors until I find something that works, and then you want to brush off as much extra paint as possible. So you don't want that much paint left on your brush. Okay, we want to be putting this on very, very sparsely. We don't want it to look like we've just finger painted the enclosure and covered it in a thick layer of paint. That's going to look fake. We don't want that. Okay, so we want it to go on very, very fine, and just bits of it. Okay, we don't want to solid paint all that good texture that we've just spent the last few days creating. So we're just going to put it on in little bits over the top. So it's important to have a nice dry brush, and then we're going to layer the colors. So I usually like to start with a base layer first, and that's usually going to be a really light color. Okay, so I'm going to put something on that'll probably be the lightest of all the shades that will go into it. Cover it in that. Up to you how you do it. I will usually do one color at a time, and I'll do the whole enclosure, or at least a big section of it, in that color. Now, I don't match the colors exactly. I find I just mix a color until it's close enough and then whack it on and blend them in. The idea of doing this, I guess, is that it definitely helps make it look a little bit more natural. Okay, nothing's a solid color out there, it's all different shades, it's all blending together. So that's what I'm trying to replicate. So it's just lots of different colors, dry brush, fairly stiff bristles, and then we just keep going over it. And I'll often go over the same area quite a few times with different colors to sort of get that effect going. Again, this is a fairly time-consuming part of the project, but for me, this is the section that I absolutely love. This is where your enclosure will really start to take shape, and it'll really start to come together, and you'll see, you know, that image that you've been thinking, that image that you've been looking at through all your reference material. This is where it's going to come to life. Okay, so this for me is the most rewarding part of building any of these enclosures, is really getting in and getting this paint on and you know, trying to match it to the rocks that I've got that reference material for. In terms of putting it on, it is basically just sort of dabbing and lightly brushing over the top. So again, because we're trying to be really light with our color, you're not wanting to push it in too hard, you're not wanting to soak your rocks in it, you're wanting to just sort of take it over the surface and just lightly cover some of those areas. This is going to give you the best sort of outcome at the end as well. And you'll see here, you're just layering all those different colors. So as I said, start with your lighter colors first, and then we're going to work through different shades up until the final one, which is going to be the darkest color that you put on. So we're going to go back over it towards the end, and we're going to get a darker color just to again touch up that aging and highlight any specific areas that you're looking to highlight. And you can see here instantly by putting those darker lines, those crevices aren't that deep at all, maybe 5 to 10 mils, okay, but by putting that darker line through them and then using the lighter paints around them really helps to bring out that crevice, and it makes it look a lot deeper than what it actually is. So that's what we're going for, a lot of illusion here, trying to create rocks that look as natural as possible. Again, it is all trial and error, okay, so don't stress if you don't get the exact color that you wanted first time round. Just keep working with it. As long as you're not putting the colors on too thick, you won't have a problem going back and re-aging it. And if you really have to, you can start right from the very beginning, go back, spray your black aging over it, let it dry, and just start again if you're really unhappy with it. But most of the time I found you can just change the areas that you want by changing your color a little bit, going back, changing your brush strokes, and you'll soon have something that you're happy with. So we're just going to go through and speed this up quickly for you, but you'll get a bit of a look as it races through here nice and quickly. You'll see how those rocks are changing as you add the different layers of colour to them. And as I said, I'll go back and do the same piece time and time again until I get the colour that I'm looking for. So what we're looking at now is I've decided once I got to this point that I wasn't really happy with how dark the enclosure was. I didn't think it was looking like the reference material that I had. Okay, so like I said before, if you're not happy with something, go back and do it again. So I'm going to go back now. I'm adding a lot more black, so it's going on again quite watery. I've watered down that black quite a lot. I'm using a paintbrush this time instead of a spray bottle so that I can target the areas that I'm looking for. Now I'm going to go back and do this across the entire enclosure, or most of it. So I'm going to look for areas that I really want to highlight. I'm going to make the black that I put on those areas a lot darker and a lot thicker in terms of how much paint is in the water than other areas. Now, of course, we need to do the individual rocks. So again, exactly the same. We're going to water those down. I'm putting this on really dark this time to match those inside rocks. And then again, we're going to go back. This is the following day. I like to leave anything when you're using that watered down black. It is usually 12 to 24 hours to dry before you go back and start painting with your acrylics over the top. This just gives it a really good time to dry out. You'll find as it dries, the color is going to change a lot. Normally it lightens a fair bit, so it'll give you a better indication. If you start putting things on wet, I've found once it dries, you're going to lose a lot of your color. So as well as doing the background, it is of course important that we jump in and do the rocks. As I said before, it's important to have these rocks. They bring the entire enclosure together, and we need them to match the background. They need to look like smaller shards that have broken off over time, through weather events. So again, this gives you a little bit probably closer view of just how I'm aging these rocks. That black layer went on the day before, and now we're going to start with our different colors. So we've got that dry brush method. We're going to cover most of it in our first color, which will be the lightest color that we put on. You will see how the rock on the left there is quite dark. That's what the one on the right that I'm working on started like. So don't be concerned if you think you've done it too dark. You can always lighten it up with your painting, and you'll see this rock really come together as you start getting all those different shades of color in there. Now, once you do get all your bulk color on, you can of course go back through and highlight different areas. You can start to add maybe limestone where it's dripped down, you've got a white streak. A black streak maybe in some areas could be appropriate, where algae and water have run down a rock face, and even putting tinges of green and yellow in there to look like different sort of moss and algae that might be growing on that rock as well. So you can get in there and get all those little shades and colors and really start to make this look like you want it to look. Okay, it's all up to individual preference on what you're going for, and your reference material, what you're looking for, and how much detail you want to add in. So again, last coat for this one, I'm using a really fine brush, and I've got a dark color. This is the darkest color I'm going to put on this rock, and I'm going back over different areas just to highlight it, to sort of age that lighter colors that we put on. I know it seems a bit odd doing it back to front. You put your black on, then you lighten it, and then you put black on again, but I find it has given the best results. So once all of that's done, of course, all our painting is finished. It's time to start getting our substrate in. So for my substrate mix, I'm using a standard potting mix. I use some orchid bark, some peat moss, some sphagnum moss, some coarse and fine sand, whatever I have on hand really, and some activated charcoal, or some potting charcoal as well, the stuff you'd use for propagation. So I chuck this all together in a rubbish bin, give it a good mix, and this is going to be my plant base layer. So it's not the entire enclosure. We are going to cap it off with something to suit the theme, but this is the layer where all our plants are going to grow. So again, sphagnum going in. I haven't got any great recipe or amounts. I kind of just mix it at a whim. That last bit there that we just threw in is some compost as well. So I have compost piles, I have a worm farm, and I'll often get bits of soil and broken down food matter and vegetable matter that's been broken down by the worms and the bugs in those, and throw that into my garden mix or into my plant mix as well. If I get a pile of worms in there, even better. That starts off my entire cleanup crew for the enclosure. So this is the consistency that we're looking for. It's basically something that's going to be pretty well drained. So in terms of substrate, for this enclosure I use a mixture of coarse sand and deco or decomposed granite. I have some stones laying around, some small pebbles, so that's what I use as a drainage layer, followed by some fly screen over the top to stop any of our soil getting down. Start putting your soil in, and then it's a matter of deciding where your plants are going to go. In terms of choosing plants, you need to obviously look at your lighting levels. This is a very bright enclosure. It has a lot of high-powered LEDs in there. And also, I like to try and choose my plants to look as natural as possible from the area that I'm building the enclosure to replicate. So these are all, fairly small shrubs. I'll link all the plants that I've used down in the comments there as well. But basically try and get those in, get your top layer in, which in this case is the sand deco level, and then get your rocks in there as well. Now you want to put them in and then put a lot of that top layer back around. So you want to be able to have your rocks built in, not looking like they're just sitting on the surface. So from here we're almost finished. It's just a matter of putting in the final touches. Now I'm pretty lucky. I have a lot of native plants in my yard and garden, so I was basically just able to go out, forage around, find some leaf litter, some seed pods, some sticks from plants that are very similar to the ones that I've put into the enclosure. I was able to bring those back, crush them up a little bit, get that aged look to them, sprinkle them throughout the enclosure. It's these fine details that really do help to bring everything together. So you can see how the leaf litter, the sand, it's kind of mixed up. It's scattered over the rock work. It's not just on the ground. Okay, you want to make this look like it would out in nature. So we're looking at bits of sticks and seed pods, bits of sand, everything's mixed in, and that gives that final touch for us. Alright, well that wraps things up, folks. I hope you enjoyed that little video. Maybe you learned a few tips and tricks in there about having a go at making your own naturalistic background for your reptiles. If you enjoyed what you saw today, make sure you give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And if there's anything else you would like to know, maybe a little bit more in-depth information on a certain topic regarding building or keeping our reptiles, then feel free to drop those in the comments for me. You can also find us, of course, on Facebook and Instagram. So thanks for watching, and we will see you on the next episode of the Natural Herb Keeper.